In October 1917, two women named Helen Purviance and Margaret Sheldon were kneeling in front of a wood-burning stove in a muddy French village called Montier-sur-Saulx, frying dough in a small pan, 7 pieces at a time. It had rained for 36 days straight. The trench lines nearby held soldiers who had not been dry or warm or fed anything resembling home cooking in over a month. Across the front, millions of men were dug into the earth of France and Belgium, and by the time the war ended a little over a year later, it would have killed an estimated 9 million soldiers and left millions more wounded, gassed, shell-shocked, or missing. Disease killed almost as efficiently as artillery. Mud alone, thick and endless, drowned men and horses where they stood. This was the deadliest conflict human beings had ever built for themselves, and two women with a wine bottle for a rolling pin and a soldier's helmet for a mixing bowl decided that the answer to some small fraction of that misery was fried dough. A donut, not a metaphor. An actual, greasy, sugar-dusted donut, the kind you can buy today for around $1 at a gas station without thinking twice about it. So how did a scrap of fried dough, cooked in a helmet behind the trenches of the deadliest war the world had yet seen, end up as one of the defining symbols of American comfort food, tangled up with feminism, industrial capitalism, and a marketing machine that still sells billions of dollars of pastry every single year? That was 1917, but the story of the donut does not begin in a shattered French village. It begins almost 2,000 years earlier, in the kitchens of the Roman Empire, and it takes a very long detour through the Netherlands before it ever reaches a trench. Start in ancient Rome, sometime in the 1st century, in a kitchen that would have smelled of hot oil and honey. Roman cooks made a treat called Globi, small balls of cheese-enriched dough, deep-fried until golden, then drenched in honey and sprinkled with poppy seeds. The Roman writer Cato the Elder recorded a version of the recipe in his work on agriculture, which makes Globi one of the oldest documented fried dough recipes in the Western world. They were not called donuts. Nobody in Rome would have recognized the word, but the basic idea, dough plus fat plus heat plus sweetness, is exactly the same idea that eventually produces the modern donut. Fried dough, it turns out, is one of those inventions that human beings arrived at independently, over and over again, on nearly every continent. Ancient Egyptian bakers fried dough in oil and coated it in honey. Medieval Islamic cooks across the Middle East and North Africa made lukumades and zalabia, fritters soaked in syrup, some of which are still served today, essentially unchanged over 1,000 years later. Indigenous peoples across the Americas fried various forms of dough long before European contact, and after contact, fry bread became its own complicated, painful, and resilient food tradition among Native American communities, born out of government rations rather than abundance. None of these cultures were talking to each other. None of them had the word genetics, and none of them had the word chemistry either. But they had all figured out the same basic principle: that dough dropped into hot fat puffs up, crisps on the outside, and turns into something worth fighting over. Call it convergent culinary evolution. Humans, it seems, cannot resist the idea of bread cooked in fat. Think about the mechanics of it for a second, because they explain why this dish appears so many times in so many places independent of any single point of origin. Fat conducts heat far more efficiently than water does, which means a piece of dough dropped into hot oil cooks in minutes instead of the hour or more it might take in an oven. No oven required, no complex baking chamber, no precise temperature control beyond a pot and a fire. Frying was democratic in a way that baking, historically, was not. A peasant kitchen with one pot and a fire could produce fried dough just as easily as a wealthy one, which is part of why versions of this snack show up across so many different economic classes, in so many different centuries, largely unchanged in their basic logic. Sweetness varied by what was locally available. Honey in Rome and the Islamic world, sugar once it became cheaper after European colonization of the Caribbean, maple syrup and molasses in colonial America, But the underlying formula, flour, fat, heat, sweetener, stayed remarkably stable across roughly 2,000 years and 3 continents. That stability is rare in food history. Most dishes mutate wildly as they travel. This one barely changed at all. The version of the story that leads most directly to the modern American donut, though, comes from the Netherlands. In 1667, a Dutch cookbook titled The Sensible Cook published a recipe for something called Olykoek, which translates bluntly to oil cake. Olykoek was a ball of sweetened dough, sometimes stuffed with raisins, chopped apple, or almonds, fried in fat until golden. It was heavy. It was dense. The centers often stayed raw or undercooked while the outside browned, or the outside scorched while the inside stayed gummy, a problem that would not get solved for another 2 centuries. When Dutch settlers crossed the Atlantic and founded New Amsterdam, the colony that would eventually become New York City, they brought Olykoek with them. The recipe took root in the Hudson River Valley and stayed there for generations, passed down through Dutch-American households as a holiday treat. By the time the American writer Washington Irving published The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1819, he described a Dutch country tea table loaded with fried dough treats, proof that the word and the food were already fixtures of American life more than a century before anyone fried one in a trench. There is a small etymology puzzle buried in the name itself, and it is worth pausing on because nobody agrees on the answer. The dough part is obvious enough. The nut part is not. One theory holds that early bakers dropped a literal nut, a walnut or hazelnut, into the center of the dough ball for flavor, before the ring shape existed to solve that problem mechanically. Another theory suggests the small, round shape simply reminded people of a nut in size and appearance, the same logic that gives us the word doughboy for a soldier or peanut for a legume that is not actually a nut at all. A third theory claims the word nut is a corruption of the word knot, since the earliest twisted crullers were sometimes tied into a literal knot shape before frying. Nobody can prove which explanation is correct, and food historians have been arguing about it for well over a century. What is not in dispute is that Americans had settled on the word donut or doughnut long before any of the more famous 19th and 20th century milestones in this story, the hole, the machine, the war, ever occurred. Here is the detail that makes this next part strange. For roughly 200 years, the donut had no hole. It was a solid ball of dough, and it stayed that way, undercooked centers and all, until sometime around the middle of the 1800s. The most famous explanation for how the hole appeared belongs to a sea captain from Maine named Hanson Gregory. According to the story that circulated for decades, Gregory's mother made him fried dough cakes to take on long sea voyages, and once Gregory became captain of his own ship, he grew frustrated with the raw, greasy centers of the traditional cake. So, sometime around 1847, he supposedly punched the soggy middle out of a donut with the spoke of his ship's wheel during a storm, needing both hands free to steer. The hole let the dough cook evenly all the way through. No more raw center, no more compensating with a scorched crust. It is a wonderful story. It has ships, it has a storm, it has a mother's recipe and a son's ingenuity. Now, historians are not convinced it happened quite that way, and Gregory himself apparently admitted in a later interview that at least part of the tale was invented. But the fact that Americans found this story so satisfying that they held an actual public debate about it, a real event in 1941 at the Astor Hotel in New York City called the Great Donut Debate, convened specifically to determine who really put the hole in the donut, tells you something. People wanted an origin myth for their pastry, and Hanson Gregory, real sailor, real captain, uncertain hole puncher, became the answer that stuck. Whether every detail of the legend holds up under scrutiny remains genuinely debated among food historians, but the practical effect is not in dispute at all. By the mid-1800s, the ring shape had become standard, and the American donut had essentially arrived at the form we would recognize today, roughly 70 years before it ever reached a French battlefield. Which brings the story back to Montier-sur-Seulles and to the two women who turned a regional American snack into a national symbol almost overnight. But you have to understand the context to see why a fried pastry mattered as much as it did. The First World War was not an ordinary conflict, and it deserves to be described honestly rather than sanitized into a quaint backdrop for a food story. By the time the fighting ended in November of 1918, an estimated 9 million soldiers had been killed, alongside a roughly comparable number of civilian deaths caused by military action, starvation, and disease. Trench warfare produced casualty patterns the world had never seen before. Machine guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute, artillery barrages that could kill thousands of men in a single day, and chemical weapons, chlorine gas and mustard gas, that blinded and burned men who never saw the enemy who attacked them. Soldiers lived for weeks or months at a time in trenches that flooded with freezing water, where a condition called trench foot could rot flesh from constant wet cold, and where rats, lice, and disease killed almost as efficiently as the fighting itself. Men who survived direct combat frequently did not survive dysentery, influenza, or infected wounds that modern antibiotics would have cured in days. This was the environment the Salvation Army volunteers walked into voluntarily, not as combatants, not under any legal obligation, and not with any guarantee of safety. When the United States entered the First World War in the spring of 1917, the Salvation Army sent a delegation to France to assess what the American troops actually needed beyond ammunition and orders. The organization's conclusion was that soldiers needed something that looked and felt like home. So the Salvation Army established small huts near the front lines, staffed largely by women volunteers, who wrote letters for illiterate soldiers, mended uniforms, ran informal religious services, and tried, in whatever ways they could, to remind homesick young men that someone back home still thought about them. Roughly 250 Salvation Army officers and volunteers eventually made the crossing to France for this purpose. A strikingly small number, given the scale of the effort they are remembered for. Among them were Ensign Helen Purviance and Ensign Margaret Sheldon, two young women stationed with the American 1st Division. After 36 consecutive days of rain, with morale collapsing and supplies dwindling, Purviance and Sheldon looked at what they had left in storage: flour, sugar, lard, baking powder, cinnamon, and canned milk, and tried to figure out what they could make without a real kitchen. Pancakes needed syrup they did not have. Cake and pie needed baking equipment they did not have either. What they landed on was dough, fried in fat, which required almost nothing except heat and a container. They had no rolling pin, so an empty wine bottle became one. They had no donut cutter, so they used a knife to slice the dough into strips and twisted the strips into crullers by hand. Purviance knelt in front of a small pot-bellied stove, tending the fire, while Sheldon fried the dough 7 pieces at a time in a small pan. I was literally on my knees, Purviance later recalled, describing that first batch, cooked with what she called a prayer in her heart that it would do more than just satisfy hunger. By the end of that first day, working entirely by hand with no real equipment, the two women had produced roughly 150 doughnuts. The next day, word had already spread through the surrounding camps, carried quite literally on the smell of hot fried dough drifting across muddy fields where men had not smelled anything like a bakery in weeks. They doubled their output. Soldiers began lining up. This was not a small operation for long. Other Salvation Army volunteers picked up the technique. Huts across the front adopted it, and as demand exploded, production numbers climbed to a scale that sounds almost invented. Individual volunteers eventually reported making between 2,500 and 9,000 doughnuts in a single day. 9,000. Think about that for a second. Two women with a wine bottle and a soldier's helmet had, within roughly a year, scaled their improvised recipe into something closer to an assembly line, entirely by hand, entirely under wartime conditions, entirely because a handful of volunteers decided that homesick men deserved a taste of something familiar. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. The nickname stuck almost immediately. American soldiers were already known as Doughboys, a term with its own murky and disputed origins dating back decades before the war. But the arrival of the Salvation Army's fried dough cemented an association that popular memory has never really let go of. The women themselves picked up a nickname too: Donut Girls or Donut Lassies, depending on which regiment or which newspaper was doing the talking. And here is the part that tends to get lost in the sweeter version of this story. These were not safe rear echelon kitchens. The huts were often close enough to the front to be within range of artillery. Volunteers endured many of the same physical hardships as the soldiers they served: cold, exhaustion, constant danger, food shortages of their own. This was, by any honest measure, a genuinely dangerous volunteer assignment, undertaken by women who were legally barred from serving in the American armed forces at the time, 3 full years before American women would even win the right to vote, and more than 3 decades before women would be permitted to serve as full, permanent members of the United States military. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, who served in France himself, later wrote that before the war he had considered the Salvation Army a well-meaning collection of eccentrics. After watching what its volunteers did in the trenches, he said, whatever help he could offer the organization was theirs. That is not a small reversal of opinion, and it captures something about how quickly a homemade pastry, delivered under fire, rewrote an entire institution's public reputation. When the war ended and the Doughboys came home, they brought the Craving with them. An entire generation of American veterans now associated the donut with survival, with comfort, with the specific and very human relief of being handed something warm and sweet by someone who had risked getting shelled to bring it to you. That kind of emotional imprint does not fade quickly, and it did not fade here either. Demand for donuts across the United States spiked in the years immediately following the war, driven almost entirely by veterans who wanted the taste of the trenches, minus the trenches. This is where the story takes a turn nobody in Montier-sur-Seau could have predicted, because the same post-war donut craving that honored 2 women frying dough by hand was about to be industrialized by a man who had never served in the war at all. His name was Adolf Levitt, a Jewish refugee from Tsarist Russia who had settled in New York City, and by 1920 was running a small bakery in Harlem. Levitt noticed the post-war surge in donut demand and started frying batches in a window facing the street, the same low-tech, one-at-a-time method Purviance and Sheldon had used in France. It worked too well. Crowds gathered on the sidewalk just to watch the donuts fry, and Levitt could not produce them fast enough to meet demand, especially from the theater crowds pouring out of a nearby movie house each night. So he set out to build a machine that could do what his own hands could not. His first several prototypes failed outright. He kept building anyway. By 1920, on roughly his 12th attempt, Levitt finally produced a working automatic donut machine, an odd, whirring contraption that dropped rings of dough into a vat of boiling oil, mechanically flipped them at the correct interval, and lifted the finished donuts out on a moving ramp into a waiting basket. He called it, without a hint of irony, the wonderful, almost human automatic donut machine. The name was absurd. The machine was not. A single unit could turn out roughly 1,000 identical donuts an hour, a rate that no human baker, however fast, could hope to match by hand. Levitt built his company, the Donut Corporation of America, around that machine, and opened a chain of shops under the name Mayflower Donuts, eventually spreading to 18 locations nationwide. He is also generally credited as the first person to popularize the simplified spelling donut, dropping the older, more formal donut in the name of easier signage and easier advertising. By the time he was done, Levitt had turned a wartime comfort food into an industrial commodity, and in the process built a personal fortune reported at roughly $25 million, an enormous sum for the period. Levitt's timing was not an accident either. He later explained, in interviews given after his company had grown into a national operation, that he had been directly inspired by stories he heard from returning veterans about the donuts fried for them by Salvation Army volunteers in France, the same wartime association that was already driving foot traffic to his Harlem bakery window before the machine ever existed. In other words, the man who mechanized the donut and turned it into an American industrial product was, by his own account, chasing a craving that two women with a wine bottle had created by hand. His first bakery attempt actually failed for an almost comic reason. The fumes from his frying oil drifted into the movie theater next door and disrupted the audience badly enough that the theater owner complained and Levitt was forced to relocate. He tried again in a new location. This time, instead of hiding the frying process, he put it directly in the window, in full view of the street, and turned the manufacturing process itself into free advertising, a decision that would define donut retail for the rest of the 20th century. Walk past almost any donut shop today with a window facing the sidewalk, and you are looking at a marketing decision Adolf Levitt made in New York City roughly a century ago. Here is the uncomfortable irony sitting underneath Levitt's success story, the kind the channel loves to dig into. The very demand that made his machine profitable existed because of two women who had done the opposite of industrialization. Two volunteers frying dough by hand in a war zone, with no machinery at all, no patents, no company, no fortune. Purviance and Sheldon created the emotional appetite. Levitt built the factory that fed it. Neither one of them could have done what the other did, and the modern donut industry, worth billions of dollars today, rests on both halves of that equation in roughly equal measure. The machine did not stay a novelty for long. In 1934, donuts were featured as a signature food at the Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago, promoted explicitly as a symbol of American industrial progress. Food made by a machine for an audience that was still, in the depths of the Great Depression, hungry for evidence that American ingenuity could produce abundance out of very little. Then, in 1937, a man named Vernon Rudolph founded a small donut company in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, using a secret yeast-raised recipe he had purchased from a French chef in New Orleans, a recipe the company has, remarkably, kept locked away and largely unchanged for nearly 9 decades. Rudolph originally intended to sell his donuts wholesale to grocery stores rather than directly to customers. That plan lasted almost no time at all. The smell of frying dough drifting out of his shop drew so many passers-by that he began cutting holes in the exterior wall so people on the sidewalk could buy donuts hot, straight off the line, without even stepping inside. A direct echo, whether Rudolph knew it or not, of the exact same window front theater Adolf Levitt had staged in Harlem more than a decade earlier. Rudolph called his company Krispy Kreme. By 1950, Krispy Kreme had introduced its own automated equipment, a compact machine that could mix, shape, fry, cool, and box-finish donuts in a footprint of only about 7 square feet, further shrinking the gap between an individual worker and an industrial-scale bakery. The donut had gone, in roughly 3 decades, from an improvised trench ration to a fully mechanized, mass-produced American staple. And then, in 1938, the Salvation Army's Chicago chapter closed the loop deliberately. During the depths of the Great Depression, facing an enormous and growing need for charitable donations, the organization created the first official National Donut Day, both as a fundraiser for people struggling through the economic collapse and as a formal tribute to the donut lassies of the First World War. The choice was not random. It was a calculated act of institutional memory, tying a beloved, cheap, mass-produced pastry directly back to the 2 women who had improvised it in a French village 2 decades earlier. National Donut Day is still celebrated every year on the first Friday of June, and most of the people lining up for a free glazed ring at a donut shop that morning have no idea that the entire holiday exists because of Helen Purviance and Margaret Sheldon. This is where the story gets bigger than a single country. Fried dough had already been reinvented independently across multiple continents, but the American version, ring-shaped, machine-made, marketed with unapologetic patriotic branding, became the version that spread globally through franchising in the second half of the 20th century. Dunkin, founded in 1950 in Quincy, Massachusetts, eventually expanded to more than 12,000 locations across roughly 40 countries. Krispy Kreme, the North Carolina company built on a stolen French recipe and a compact automated machine, expanded to more than 1,400 locations across roughly 30 countries. Regional and international chains sprang up in parallel, from Mr. Donut in Japan to J.Co in Indonesia, each adapting the basic Dutch Roman American template to local tastes: matcha glazes, yuzu fillings, pandan cream, red bean paste, proof that the underlying idea, fried dough plus sugar plus heat, is elastic enough to absorb almost any culture it lands in. But the donut is far more than just a breakfast pastry today, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. In the 21st century, the global donut market has been valued by various industry analysts anywhere from roughly $5 billion to over $15 billion annually, a wide range that reflects how differently research firms define the category. But even the conservative estimates place it comfortably in the billions. In the United States alone, industry estimates put annual donut production at somewhere north of 10 billion units a year, a number so large it is genuinely difficult to picture. 10 billion rings and rounds of fried dough, produced, sold, and eaten in a single country in a single year. North America still accounts for roughly half of global donut market revenue, driven by exactly the chains that grew out of Levitt's machine and Rudolph's secret recipe. Krispy Kreme and Dunkin alone are estimated to control somewhere between roughly a third and nearly two-thirds of the entire global market, depending on which analyst you ask and how narrowly they define the category, with the remaining share scattered across hundreds of regional chains and independent bakeries competing on novelty and local identity rather than raw scale. That kind of consolidation at the top, paired with a long tail of small independent operators at the bottom, is the same market structure you see in coffee, in beer, and in fast food generally. Industries built around a cheap, comforting, habit-forming product that a handful of giants can mass-produce almost anywhere on Earth, while smaller shops survive by being the opposite: local, small batch, and personal. And here is the detail that should catch you off guard. The gourmet donut movement of the past 15 years, the artisanal shops charging $4 or $5 for a single donut stuffed with brown butter or bourbon caramel or matcha custard, is not a rejection of the mass-produced original. It is a direct descendant of it, using the same basic ring shape that a sea captain in Maine may or may not have punched into existence with a ship's wheel spoke, dressed up in flavors that would have been unimaginable to Purviance and Sheldon frying dough over a wood stove in the rain. Here is a fact that tends to genuinely surprise people, and it has nothing to do with sugar content. The donut's ring shape, mathematically speaking, is a torus, a solid object with exactly one hole through it. And topologists, mathematicians who study shapes that can be stretched and deformed without tearing, use the donut constantly as their go-to example when explaining topology to beginners. A coffee mug and a donut, in the strict language of topology, are considered the same shape because each has exactly one hole and can theoretically be reshaped into the other without cutting or gluing. It is a genuinely strange fact to learn about a pastry that its shape became a foundational teaching tool in an entire branch of higher mathematics, largely by accident, simply because the ring shape a 19th century sea captain may or may not have invented turned out to be topologically interesting. The donut has also, somewhat improbably, made it to space. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station have requested and received donuts as part of care packages, and the pastry has shown up more than once in astronaut interviews as one of the specific foods crew members said they missed most while in orbit, alongside pizza and fresh fruit, two things that do not travel well in zero gravity either. Back on Earth, the industry built around this shape now spans a genuinely staggering range of scale. From a single artisanal shop in a strip mall selling a handful of flavors a day, to Krispy Kreme's landmark nationwide distribution partnership with McDonald's, finalized in April of 2025, that put the company's donuts inside thousands of additional restaurant locations across the United States in a single stroke. The market has not been immune to strange modern pressure either. In 2024, Dunkin reported temporary donut shortages affecting a small percentage of its stores, tied to supplier disruptions, a reminder that even a product this deeply embedded in American life still runs, ultimately, through a fragile and very modern supply chain of flour, sugar, and industrial fryers. Not bad for a pastry that started as an emergency substitute for pancakes nobody had syrup for. It was there in ancient Rome, honey-drenched and sold in the street to anyone with a coin to spare. It was there in Dutch kitchens, dense and raw in the center, carried across an ocean by settlers building a new colony out of a swampy island that would one day become New York City. It was there in a Maine sea captain's possibly exaggerated legend, the moment the whole appeared and the shape we know today finally took form. And it was there again in 1941, when grown adults gathered in a hotel ballroom to formally debate who deserved credit for that hole. It was there, most famously, in a muddy French village in 1917, fried by two women on their knees in front of a wood stove, under artillery range, for soldiers who had not tasted anything resembling home in over a month. It was there when a Russian immigrant, watching crowds gather outside his Harlem bakery window, built a machine that could outproduce any human baker on Earth. It was there in 1934, held up at a Chicago World's Fair as proof that a nation gripped by depression could still make abundance out of flour and fat. It was there when the Salvation Army turned two volunteers' wartime improvisation into a permanent, deliberate national holiday, and it has been there every first Friday of June since. It is there now, in gas stations and gourmet bakeries, in astronaut care packages and mathematics classrooms, in break rooms and drive-thrus, in a business worth billions of dollars a year, built on a recipe that began as nothing more than flour, sugar, lard, and desperation. The next time you pick one up without thinking twice, worth about $1, gone in 4 bites, it is worth remembering that this exact shape, this exact idea, once meant the difference between a soldier feeling forgotten in the mud and a soldier feeling, for just a few minutes, like someone back home still cared whether he made it out. Not bad for a hole in some fried dough. If this is the kind of history you like digging into, do me a favor and hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which part of this story surprised you the most, and I will see you in the next one.